All right, we're in. Welcome back, everybody. Joining me today is Dr. Mike Huemer. Dr. Huemer, thank you for coming on.
Yes, thank you for having me.
No problem. Good to have you. So today we're going to be talking about, kind of broadly, about animal rights, animal ethics, some of the issues surrounding that, issues of killing animals, when it's okay, if at all, to kill them, use them, all that. And so there's plenty to talk about this, something I've been interested in very recently, some applied ethics questions. And Dr. Huemer's written on this. So if you want to go ahead, if it's cool with you, we can just start. If you want to give an introduction to kind of some of the work you've done in this area, maybe any forthcoming work and sort of general arguments you've given or engaged with, anything like that. So yeah, it's a general introduction if you want to.
Well, yeah, I mean, for a while I didn't write anything about this. I became vegetarian in college, which was a long time ago, more than 20 years ago. But I didn't write anything about it for a long time because I didn't have anything new to say, because like all of the arguments are obvious and have been said by other people. But I pretty recently published this book, Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism, which you can get on Amazon. You can and should get. And and I did it because I wanted to create kind of like a more accessible and entertaining form of the case for vegetarianism or veganism. There's some new stuff like more towards the end of it, but also I cover what I think are sort of standard arguments. And like I cover the things that people have said to me over the decades, things that I've seen online and also in person, in-person conversations about why they think that animals don't matter, or it's okay to kill them and for fun, for kill them for the pleasure of tasting their body parts. And like there's a wide variety of dumb things that people say, and they all of the things that I remembered that people said appeared in the dialogues. Right, so it should be more accessible than a typical academic article, and also shorter than a typical book. So I thought I would reach more people that way.
All right, so perfect middle ground there. Well, we'll get into all of some of this as we go on and talk, and we'll get more into some of the better objections, maybe, or not even better, but more sophisticated. But what are I don't know if you probably don't want to give away any of the book, but just kind of generally, what do you think are like some of like just the very standard assumptions people make about animal rights that kind of are misguided or wrongheaded or go wrong? Like, what is just something people, maybe a common objection or just mistakes people make?
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like the most common problem is that people have not thought seriously about the issue, right? So like you might say the mistake of just completely dismissing the issue and completely ignoring it, right? And then if you actually think about it for a second, you realize, oh wait, like I don't have any answer to why I think it's okay to torture creatures who belong to another species. Right? I'm like, it's just like you just assume that that's totally fine, as far as I can tell, because we've been doing it for a long time, right? Okay, but if you try to so, and there will be people who are just like supremely confident. They've got like near 100% credence, but they have like no basis and they've never thought about it, right? So, and then when you try to get people to say, okay, and so why do you think that's true? Like, and then they say something like, well, humans are smart. So like, okay, so our species is smarter than the other species, so that's why it's okay for us to do whatever we want. Okay, and then things that are variations on this, like we understand morality or something, and the other creatures don't understand morality. Kind of a variation on our being smarter. Okay, and then you go, okay, so what? So is the moral claim here like if you're smart, then it's okay to torture those who are not smart? And is that true? Like, does that sound right? And if that's true, can you say something about why? It's like, well, there's not really a good answer to that. And then, then you kind of start to think, you should think, when you hear this, so does that mean that like if you meet mentally retarded people, like you can torture them? Just because they're dumb, so their interests don't matter. If, you have a newborn baby, newborn babies are really not smart, right? They can't do anything except cry. So, okay, so is it okay to like smack the baby around because like, its pain doesn't matter because it's dumb? No, that doesn't seem right, right? So, in other contexts, it doesn't seem like we think that your intelligence determines whether your interests matter or not, right? Anyway, that might be the most common thing. There's like a
Yeah.
bunch of other things that people say, which are all discussed in the book.
Very nice. Yeah, so we look forward to reading some more of that. Yeah, I think kind of you touched on there a little bit, sort of like this tradition assumption, or like people have kind of now made it a little more sophisticated, worked into an evolutionary context. Like one justification I hear a lot is like, well, we've always eaten meat, it's always been this way. We kind of have dominion, or the other one, the evolutionary one, is like, oh, well, we evolved to eat meat, or kind of our
Yeah.
evolution was guided by eating meat. And I don't know if you want to say anything more on those, but I mean, there's always, of course, the case that, like, well, doesn't mean we have to now, right? Like, it's kind of sort of irrelevant.
Yeah.
But that's another common thing
Yeah.
people say is,
Yeah. And then, okay, so yeah, it might be true. So it is true that it's been going on for a long time, although factory farming hasn't been going on for a long time. That's a new invention, which is sort of like um, that's the most horrible thing that we're doing, right?
mm-hmm.
It's true that we've been eating meat for a long time. But like we've been doing a lot of things, like we've been going to war for a long time, and that's been for for the entire time that human beings have existed. And actually, it's been worse in the past. So, does that mean that, it's bad that we're decreasing the amount of war, right? Because it's tradition and it's nature, okay? And then you can say, well, we evolved to do it. And so, that's true. Like, I mean, there are sort of, um, it's not like you're determined to do something, but evolution could give you predispositions to behave in certain ways, right? So you have like a natural desire to eat meat or something like this. I think that's true. I think the thing about war, it's also true. Like I think there's a natural predisposition for humans to go to war with each other, but nobody says so. That means that war is totally okay. Um, well, sometimes the thing you have a natural disposition to do is bad, and you should, reduce it and hopefully stop. Like maybe we can stop killing each other and also stop, torturing and killing the other creatures.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, that seems like a lot of times going to come around as just a sort of naturalistic fallacy. It's like it doesn't really matter that we're guided to do these things, or evolution's given us this predisposition. It's still wrong, so it doesn't really touch the ethical problems with. If the ethical problems go through, it doesn't touch those. So it's not any kind of defeater. So yeah, so talking a little bit more on your work on animal rights, now we can talk a little bit about maybe sort of the animal liberation movement and kind of all that, starting with Peter Singer and kind of just the veganism movement, because now there's this, I guess the very broad question in animal rights and animal ethics is like, there's a couple, I guess, that I think of, and maybe there's some more I'm forgetting, but like just generally, it's like, well, what moral obligations do we have to non-human animals? And I like using that term because we're animals too. Like, so
Yeah.
what moral obligations do we have to them, but also like what rights do they have and how do they differ from ours? Um, and it's like what can we justifiably do to them, if at all? So I mean, there's kind of, I wonder if you agree with this and kind of what your thought is, but there's kind of like this vegan movement now that's not only against eating meat but using animal products of any kind, whether it be wearing leather, but they're also part of this animal liberation. So there are groups that even work on like liberating animals from factory farming situations. So I guess
Yeah.
so. There's an interesting question there that rises with like property, like whether or not animals can be owned as property. Because if not, then of course these liberation groups are completely justified in freeing them. Same as like freeing like slaves almost. Like it's sort of like you actually have a moral obligation to do it. But then of course there's going to be the legal side, and like the farmer's side are going to say, well, I own these chickens or these cows, so you can't. This is stealing. So I kind of wonder
Yeah.
like if there's kind of some interesting ethical like gray areas surrounding the animal liberation movements. Like what steps should we take there, do you think, and kind of what's justifiable action to take in these contexts?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so legally you can own animals, and so legally, if you you free somebody's animals, then you're stealing.
Hmm.
And so, but the law is often wrong. And
Yeah.
basically, I think the only reason you need to take this into account is prudential, which is to say you can get in trouble, right? And then if you get arrested and thrown in jail, then you won't be able to do any more activism after that. So, like that's the main reason why you should think twice about that, right? But Other than that, it's totally justified to try to free animals that are being tortured or whatever, being harmed in some way. Um, because like, so what what the people are doing is horribly wrong, right? Like the people in the meat industry, they have no good reason for doing it. And they're doing it for profit, and they're doing it because we get a little bit of pleasure, like the consumers get a little bit of pleasure. Um, Now, so okay, morally speaking, can you own an animal? Like, I would say not, right? Like legally you can, but is that morally right? Not really, right? And so, if you think that, I mean, if you think ownership means having the right to do like whatever you want to the thing, um, I mean, you can't do stuff with your property that harms other people, but you can like destroy the property frivolously. So if I own a car, I can like just smash it for no reason. As long as I'm not hurting anyone else, you just like destroy the product. Okay, so is it morally okay to like you have an animal, just like do whatever the hell you want, just like start beating the shit out of it just for the fun of it? No, that doesn't seem right. So, so like if that's implied in property rights, which I guess it is, then you shouldn't be considered to have property rights, right?
Okay. Yeah, because I wonder, there is this question about like pet ownership, like owning pets, but the difference being generally people when they own a dog, they don't think they should like, just like kick it for no reason or as you said, beat the shit out of it or, mistreat it anyway, like feed it the wrong food, poison. So people like generally have this conception of like taking good care of their pets. But of course, they don't have sort of the same ideas when it comes to animals that are just as, if not more intelligent, like pigs. So, I mean, then do you think pet ownership is okay as long as there's like no mistreatment there and it's kind of like maybe a different conception of ownership or?
Yeah, by the way, like I have a very moderate view, but also very extreme, right? So like, that is to say, my views are controversial in the sense that almost no one in our society agrees with me, right? So like, I think I have the, less than 5% minority position, but also I think my view is very moderate in the sense that I don't make any highly questionable assumptions, right? Like I just accept sort of like basic moral principles that are totally obvious and I don't see how could be disputed. So like don't cause enormous amounts of harm for trivial reasons. I think that's like just about literally the most basic moral claim that you could hold and still believe in morality. If you think no, it's fine to cause like huge amounts of harm just for the hell of it, for like minor benefits for yourself. If you think that, I I think that's kind of like rejecting morality, right? Okay, so anyway, so my incredibly controversial views stem from totally obvious uncontroversial assumptions about morality. Anyway, okay, so I say that as an introduction to, yeah, I don't hold the more extreme views about animals. So like, I don't think that it's wrong to have a pet. What I said previously suggests that when you have a pet, you don't really literally own it, like in the same way that you own your car, but the relationship that people have with their pets normally seems fine to me. Like, the pet's there, like they take care of the pet. They're not beating the pet. Normal people, right? They're
Yeah.
not beating up the pet. They're feeding it. They're whatever, taking it out for a walk, and say seems fine, right? Um, and it's like so, people worry about things like, okay, so the animals are being exploited, or like the animal doesn't have sufficient freedom because you keep it indoors and stuff. Okay, but I don't, I don't even think the animal cares so much about these things. Like, uh, you know, like intelligence is relevant to some of the moral considerations that we apply to people. So, like, when you worry about exploiting someone, that has something to do with intelligence because you need to have a certain amount of intelligence to care about being exploited, right? So, like, I don't think that the animals care about being exploited. Well, I don't know that pet ownership is even supposed to be exploitative, but like if you ride your horse, you have a horse and you ride the horse, maybe that's exploitation, but I don't think that the horse feels exploited. So like, I'm not sure this is a real harm, right? Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's true. I'm kind of a similar mind in terms of not thinking that pet ownership in most cases is probably as long as they're not being mistreated, of course, is probably not like something that's intrinsically wrong. Um, so yeah, before we get into the justification, so going with that principle there, the mass amounts of suffering, I mean, there's some arguments that we don't even have to worry about, like the sort of like old Cartesian arguments about them not, because we know now that animals feel pain and some of the moral relevance there. Um, but there's sort of, so what do you think of like the speciesism distinction from Peter Singer, like the fact that people will say, well, these animals, they do suffer, but, or I guess I could work this more into actually what I was going to say, like one maybe utilitarian attempt at a justification of factory farming could be like, we're killing these animals, but we're creating like a general better amount of human pleasure and happiness, because we get pleasure and enjoyment and nutrition or something, even if there's like a nutrition element to it out of eating meat. And so we kind of create this, it kind of balances out because we create this flourishing for humans, but then also there could be this distinction that comes in and says, and well, the flourishing of these humans is more relevant than the flourishing or languishing of animals, just given these disparities. And we'll talk about some of the rights distinctions in a minute, but I guess like we could talk a little bit about some of the common justifications of factory farming, because as you say, most people just aren't aware really of like what's going on and how bad it really is, and like even the environmental effects of some of it, like methane gas from cows, that's like 10% contribution to global warming, which we can talk about some of that too. Most people just aren't aware that factory farming is going on and how bad it is. But for the ones that are, it's like, how could you be aware of this and not like constantly, horrified? And so, I mean, how do people rationalize this really, I guess, is the question. And maybe that's one way.
Well, so, you mentioned sort of like a utilitarian case, right? I think almost all utilitarians, maybe all utilitarians, are against factory farming and against meat consumption because, utilitarians think about the actual consequences, right? Right. So like almost all meat comes from factory farms, and basically everyone who looks at it thinks that they're horrifically cruel, right? Well, not everyone uses the term horrifically, but everyone thinks that it's cruel, right? Nobody thinks that what goes on the factory farms is totally humane or that these animals have good lives, right? And if you just think about the total quantities, which you should think about if you're doing like good consequentialist reasoning, right? Just think about the quantities first, okay? There's somewhere around 74 billion animals are slaughtered for food in the world in 1 year. Okay, so that's like 10 times the entire human population of the world. Now it's estimated that somewhere around 110 billion human beings have ever lived in the history of the world. Right, so in a couple of years, the number of animals that we torture and then kill is more than the total number of human beings who ever lived. Right, so like it's really hard to see how this can't be the worst problem. Right, it's really hard to see how this doesn't outweigh any benefit. Right, it's like not only does the harm that we're causing outweigh the benefits that we get from having a little more pleasure in our meals, it's plausible that it outweighs the total amount of benefit that all humans have ever gotten, right, from any cause. In just like a few years, that might be the case, right? So, so like I think a lot of people don't know what's going on, but partly they don't know what's going on because they don't want to. It's like if you hear about this issue at all, and if you're sort of like morally conscientious, you can do a small amount of research, right? Like go on the internet and you can watch one of these videos, right? And then, you're going to see. And like, as far as I can tell, there's like no dispute, right? Like there aren't any people out there going, no, these are happy animals in the factory farms or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Well, if so, that'd be some major cognitive dissonance. So yeah. So I mean, we've talked a little bit about. I guess while we're on the topic of factory farming, we can cover this briefly. I didn't know if we talked about this a little before we started recording. I don't know if I wanted to cover this, but as you said, there's very few people that actually believe this once they look at what's going on. It's kind of a ridiculous view, but people may share something similar, so it may be worth covering it. And there was a paper written, I don't even remember what journal it's published in. It's on academia, but I think you've read it. It's from Tim Show, and it's this paper it's like a defense of factory farming article, basically. And you may remember the argument he gives better than I do, but essentially he says, and again, I wanted to save some of this for later. I don't want to talk about the metaphysics later, but basically he argues that factory farming isn't cruel to animals. And I believe he justifies this by some move saying something like, well, they don't have like a rational intellect, or they don't have the ability to. And one thing people talk about too, actually, in regards to animal suffering and philosophy of religion, this is kind of a similar point, is they say, well, they don't have qualia, they don't have like the subjective experiences. So they may be suffering, but they're not aware from another view that they are suffering. So that's actually a view I've heard in regards to the problem of evil, but it's a little different than Show's argument. But basically, this kind of defense of factory farming runs that they don't have like the intellect, and so it may be like harming them, but it's not like morally sufficient harm. So I guess the general point that people may have is just that the harm being done to animals doesn't really matter, because either they're not aware of kind of existentially of the harm that's going on. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, okay, yeah. So there were a few different ideas that you mentioned there, right? One is, maybe the animals don't even have qualia, but I basically think nobody thinks that, or like maybe some people think that, but I think like no expert thinks that, right? That they don't actually have pain or pleasure experiences. Okay, now you can't be 100% certain, but then I can't be 100% certain that you can feel pain. So like maybe when you torture other human beings, they don't really have any qualia, and they're just like mindless automata who are acting as if they had negative experiences because of mechanisms in their brain or whatever. So like that's possible, but should I like go on that assumption and just go ahead and torture people? So no, right? If I think other people even might have experiences, I should avoid, doing the things that would inflict severe pain if they're capable of experiencing pain. Same thing applies to non-human animals, right? The other thing you suggested is like, well, they don't have self-awareness. Basically, so I think there are degrees of consciousness and degrees of self-awareness. And so it's plausible that other species have sort of like lower levels of awareness, lower levels of consciousness. And so that could plausibly make it so that their experiences are less bad or less good, if for the good experiences, than for a typical human. But going back to the thing I mentioned about the total quantities, in order for it to be the case that our pleasure from eating their flesh outweighs the suffering of like the animal's life and then being slaughtered, you would have to think that like human experiences are like a million times greater than otherwise similar animal experiences, right? And there's just like no plausible way that that's the case, right? So you could give the argument that if you have to run over either a person or a non-human animal, you should run over the animal, right? Because like humans are just capable of more kinds of goods in their lives and so on, which is partly because of their intelligence. If you have to not kill but just hurt either a human or an animal, you might think hurt the animal because like the animal is less aware, right? But you're not going to say like it's a million times less, right? Because remember the 74 billion, right? And like in order for the torture and death of 74 billion creatures to be less important than the increment of pleasure that we get in our meals, like it's going to have to be like they have millions or billions of times less awareness, and like I just don't think that's plausible. But so you mentioned the article by Tim Shao, and that's not actually what he's saying, as far as I remember it. He's not denying. So he says factory farming isn't cruel, but he's not saying that it doesn't inflict severe pain and suffering on animals. As far as I understand, he's saying, yeah, but inflicting severe pain and suffering doesn't count as cruelty if the victim of it is not smart, right? But so I don't remember entirely the details of this argument, right? But I think it had to do with their level of intelligence and ability to socially interact and be part of the community that we all are part of.
Okay. So actually a little bit weaker than what I was thinking it was going to be, because that just seems kind of ridiculous. It's like inflicting mass pain and suffering is not cruel because, yeah. And I think you talked about that already. Some of like, in what cases in regards to humans do we think that, if we just meet a person who's like got like, significantly less IQ than us, we can just like torture them for fun. It's like, it's intelligence obviously is not the only morally relevant thing. So actually, we can just kind of cover all this first. Then I want to talk a little bit more about there's kind of an interesting interplay between people's metaphysical views, I think, and then their views of like what rights are and obviously kind of some ethics and therefore applied ethics comes out of what people think about metaphysics. So people like Shao, of course, think kind of have a sort of broadly Thomistic metaphysic, which, of course, there's sort of this ensoulment and rational intellect to humans, but not to the rest of the world. But before we get into some of that, because I did want to talk about kind of the ethics of killing and metaphysics, but one last thing, and this one's been covered a lot by people working on it, but I wanted to hear your take on it too. Is there sort of this like religious argument for like factory farming and for mistreating animals? Maybe not even factory farming, but just like human dominion in general. And it's one of those arguments that even if people don't have all the theological baggage that goes along with it, they might broadly accept the point being made. And that's the kind of coming out of the Christian tradition saying like, oh, well, God created us and gave us dominion over all the earth. So therefore we have, we just have the right to kind of do whatever we want with any non-human aspect of the planet. And so it's sort of like which has kind of some negative implications, not only for animals, but also for environmental ethics. And those two are often intertwined, as we might talk about a little bit if we have time. But even if people don't accept the theological baggage there's sort of kind of this broadly, maybe it's a speciesist conception, to borrow that from Singer, that just like, oh, we kind of start off from this viewpoint, this platform that like, oh, we just kind of are superiors, kind of the world's been gifted to us, so we have kind of the right to do whatever we want with it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, one common response people have given is just that, well, I mean, the dominion doesn't need to be interpreted as cruelty, but yeah, there's probably more there.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a God, but suppose there is, and he made the earth, and then he gave it to us in some sense. And did he give it to us to just like totally abuse it and just like totally do whatever the hell we feel like? Because that doesn't really seem like the sort of thing that doesn't seem very godlike, doesn't seem typical of what God wants from us. Or did he give it to us to be responsible stewards, right? So imagine that. Okay, so somebody gave you a dog. Like, okay, I made this dog, and here I'm giving it to you, and like. And the person who gave you the dog is like a supremely perfect and just and loving and whatever being. Okay, and then they find out that you're just like beating the shit out of the dog, right? And are they going to be happy with that? It's like, some if like a good being gave you a dog, they probably gave it to you to take care of responsibly, right? Not to like torture it, right? For trivial reasons, right? So like I imagine I don't know if there's a God, but if there is, he's probably pretty upset by the shit that we're doing, right? And by the way that we're abusing the rest of his creation.
Would surely hope so. Yeah. So that gets in. Yeah, definitely. So there's kind of an interesting question here too of some people might say, well, what would you say to people then that like agree with you that like factory farming is really, really bad. But then they'll say something like, yeah, it's bad that we're doing this in this mass scale. It's cruel. But then the common thing people say is like, I think that's wrong, but I'm okay with eating meat. I just think my meat should be killed and treated humanely before it's killed. And so maybe people like say that this is like a personal choice they've made, or maybe it's like their vision of how we should go forward. Like, we should still eat meat as long as it's treated okay before it's killed. So I guess the question here is like, is the problem like factory farming, or is it eating meat in general? And factory farming is just the worst manifestation of that, or maybe both, or what do you say to that generally?
I mean, the first thing I want to say is like, okay, so this, if you agree that factory farming is wrong, that covers like probably 99% of all the meat, right? And like there will be people who will say, yeah, I don't agree that eating meat is wrong because it's possible to produce the meat humanely, but then they're just like going ahead and buying the factory farm meat, right? So like, just being totally inconsistent, right? Or just like not making an effort to be ethical, right? So I want to say that like, so that people don't use this as a distraction. It's very easy to just like come up with some excuse for distracting yourself from the immorality of your actual practices, right? Okay, so like, yeah, so like maybe there's a tiny percentage of animal products that are produced humanely. Okay, and then is it morally okay to buy those? I don't know, right? Because so, this is basically what I say when people ask me about this, standardly. There's like not an agreement within ethics about rights. so among ethicists, there's not even an agreement about whether people have rights. And if people have rights, among people who think that people have rights, there's not an agreement about why. So like what the basis is for human rights. So for that reason, like we don't know whether animals have rights either, right? Like, so, if everybody agreed that humans have rights and why, then we could take that reason and see if it applied to non-human animals, right? But since we don't know, we can't really know that. So it might be that it's okay to humanely kill the animal. So like I'm very highly confident that suffering is bad. Like I think that might be the most obvious ethical principle. But I'm not very highly confident that non-human animals have rights. Okay, but what should you do if you're not sure? You should probably like avoid doing the thing unless you have a really good reason, right? I don't. So there are these, humane certified products. So particularly if you go to Whole Foods, you can find some products that have this label that say humane certified. I don't myself buy them because I'm not sure about rights, whether you're violating the rights of the animal or not, and I just don't have a really strong reason for doing it. If I had a really strong reason, I would do it. Like if I was in danger of starvation, like that was the only food they had, then I would do it. But I wouldn't do it just for a trivial reason, like it's going to be slightly more pleasurable. Right.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I mean, I wonder about the distinction there because I also wonder then about like there's implications for hunting taken to a certain extreme. And as you said, your view is more moderate, but also obvious at the same time in terms of thinking factory farming's wrong. But a couple friends of mine who are vegans actually, and I come out of kind of a tradition, a family tradition of hunters hunting. So I've like been deer hunting and everything. But reading about animal rights sort of problematized that for me and talking to some friends who are a really big part of the vegan movement and about animal and reading Peter Singer and things like that. But people tend to not think that's wrong, and there's even some justifications like, oh, well, animals are just gonna, if you kill them in the wild like a gun, that's much better than most likely how they would die, anyways. But so there's also, but then so a couple of my friends have raised this point to me, just saying like, even if you're killing an animal humanely to eat it, and even if you're hunting and you kill an animal very quickly and cleanly, you're still kind of you're frustrating like its ends or it has intentions, desires, and you're kind of taking control of those and killing it and making it impossible for it to kind of fulfill any desires it has. And it's a being that wants to live and flourish. So killing it is still wrong because even if it's not as smart as us, like obviously these things want to survive. So killing them is wrong. So I don't know what you think there, because I mean, sure, we can kind of, there's this general ethical skepticism about rights, but what do you think about that generally, like the hunting and kind of all that?
Yeah, I mean, first, so hunting is obviously way less bad than factory farming.
Oh yeah.
Right, because the animal lives a natural life before being killed. In the factory farm, it lives this very unnatural life, and basically a life of suffering until being killed at a pretty young age. That being said, so it's a lot less bad, but is it still bad? I don't know. So again, I think it kind of depends upon whether animals have rights, right? So like I assume that when you hunt the animal, you kill it quickly and it doesn't suffer for a long time. So then it could actually be that the pleasure that you get is greater than the suffering of the animal. And this thing that you mentioned is also true, that like the animal is going to die in the wild, probably painfully, right? It's at some point it will die or probably be killed by a predator or something, and that can't be enjoyable, right? However, I mean, also I think that when you hunt, I assume this is true, that like they kill young animals, right? Like a predator would probably not be able to kill a young animal. They would probably kill the old animals because they've gotten slow or whatever. And human hunters, because they have a gun, they could just shoot like a young, strong animal. So, and it had had many years ahead of it otherwise, right? Okay, so yeah, so it's harming the animal, and then you think, okay, and why am I doing this? So like again, if you had a really good reason, like this is your only food source, do it, right? But if you have plenty of good vegetarian food available, then why are you doing it? It's like, oh, I don't know, because it's fun. It's like, Wait, because it's fun to kill other creatures? Like that's the reason? Like that doesn't seem like a good enough reason. I don't know, right?
Right. Yeah,
Um,
that wouldn't work as a justification in a lot of other cases.
yeah. And so, like, I mean, particularly because it's like it's the pleasure of killing another creature. Like, I'm not sure that that should even count as a benefit, right?
Hmm.
Like taking pleasure in causing harm to someone else. Like, I'm not sure that should even be put on the utilitarian scale, right? For weighing costs and benefits.
Yeah, definitely. Well, kind of, as you mentioned there, like obviously, like even people like vegans, even some of the more extreme ones will agree that like if it's your only food source, you can shoot and kill a deer, right? Or even like population control, some of them agree with that. Like if it's over, like if the ecosystem as a whole is being harmed, then like killing to kind of set this balance right, then that's usually fine. Especially since we've probably been the ones that have caused the disruption in the first place, for whatever reason. But so it kind of implicit there when a lot of people talk about hunting, kind of there's this implicit assumption about kind of traditionalism or for meat or something like that. But what do you think then about like trophy hunting? Because there's people that hunt like rare game, and obviously like if it's a endangered species like a rhinoceros, like you shouldn't kill that. For pretty obvious reasons as far as endangered species, but in general, like trophy hunting, people that like there's no, and maybe this is covered in the and what you said about like it's just fun or I get pleasure out of it, but there's sort of just this thing of people, I don't know if it's like a kind of like a rite of passage, or just generally people like to kill these like exotic or large animals, but not for any particular like necessitating reason. It's just like, oh well, it's
Yeah.
kind of like a sport almost, so treating it like a game. um and so
Yeah.
I don't know, is there a difference with trophy hunting, or is what you already said like affected that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think trophy hunting particularly instantiates what I was talking about, right? Like where you don't
Yeah.
have a good reason for doing it, and it's just like the pleasure of killing a large, unusual animal or something. Um, this just strikes me as a thing that a virtuous person would not do, right?
Mhm.
Because like, you should have some respect for life. Just like, life has value. And and like, okay, to sustain life requires destroying other life. That's true. That's like just a general fact. But still, if you have some respect for the value of life, I think you wouldn't kill it just for pleasure, like just so that then you could tell somebody that you killed it, right?
Yeah, for no other reason than like bragging rights or something. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
true.
like yeah,
I definitely think I've seen that as a like there's justifications of that. And there was an article I read recently about like we need to stop treating violence against animals as a game. There's always these like there's competitions even for like children to like catch and kill like large fish populations or something, and it's just kind of like treated as a game in common culture. And so I think that's kind of the general point too when we're talking about animal ethics and rights, and the this kind of the general point to be made, as you said, is kind of drawing attention to this idea that like you should kind of respect life more, to at least like stop and think before we're just kind of like mass killing living things without really stopping to think about what we're doing. So I think that's a good point. So even if like the justification ends up working out in some cases, it still should be cause for some concern. Um, so I mean, we talked a little bit before about like you said we're kind of animals probably do have conscious experience. I mean, there's sort of been some work in philosophy of mind recently, especially by really prominent philosophers like Michael Tai. Has a whole book on like whether or not animals are conscious. So I think it's, and he says they probably are, at least to an extent, because they kind of exemplify the same behavior we do. So that's sort of evidence that they react to stimuli the same way, have the same representational mental content. Because I've heard people also raise this objection, like, well, animals don't have free will like us, so they're kind of like not sort of, I guess, sort of like still a mechanistic picture. But of course, we really,
yeah,
I think the general point there, as you covered, is just we don't know enough about animal minds yet to make these sort of assumptions about what they can and can't experience. And we used
no,
to think they were just machines. So
yeah. And so about free will. I mentioned that, so I believe in free will, but I would mention that there are many philosophers who think that we don't have free will. So, as
okay,
a hypothetical, if we don't have free will, is it okay to torture us? Like, so if we don't have free will, is like human suffering totally fine and doesn't matter, right? So, if your answer is no, then also if animals don't have free will, that doesn't mean that their suffering is totally okay, right? Like, just doesn't really seem relevant. And it is plausible that the animals would not have free will, or they would have less freedom, right? Like, so human beings have control over their actions. It's plausible that animals have a lot less control. We have more control. We don't have complete control. We don't have like maximal freedom, but we have a higher degree of freedom, right? And that will have some moral implications, but it doesn't mean that like their suffering doesn't matter, right? The moral implications might be actually it means that we have more responsibilities because we have more ability to control our behavior. We have moral responsibilities to do so, to control our behavior, which the animals don't have because of their lesser capacity to do so.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point because people also say like, well, animals eat each other, and
Yeah, yeah,
we're just animals, and it's like, well, we kind of have different responsibilities towards it. We have the options to not eat meat, whereas they don't, at an evolutionary level. So that's a good comment, and that's a good. So I think what we're talking about a lot here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of like symmetry breakers, like sort of like there's always this. People try to give these symmetry breakers between animals and humans that are like relevant enough to warrant like just wanton killing of them. Like, oh well, they don't have free will, we do, and it's like then or like they're not conscious of what we are, and all these symmetry breakers seem to have just like a massive counterexamples, whether it be less functioning humans or just they're just scientifically or philosophically controversial or if not outright false. So I don't think any of those work.
no,
But one
yeah,
thing I've thought about recently, and I wanted to get your thoughts on is I had it kind of was a thought that came to me in regards to thinking about like the abortion debate and some like people on the right wing and their views on abortion versus their views on animal rights. They're generally a lot of conservatives are like really against abortion, but they don't really have any problem with just like mass slaughter of these animals, many of whom are far more able to feel pain than fetuses are at most stages, right? So, and I want to, I mean, we're not talking about abortion, so we can leave that to the side, but what it but one appeal people give me to saying like abortion's wrong, but um, you know, killing animals isn't. It's just like this appeal to human rights. They'll just say, well, we have human rights, and animals obviously don't because they're not humans. And so we talked about this a little bit. Like that's sort of yeah. We talked about this a little bit before too. Like we're kind of skeptical of even that, but it's kind of made me wonder also. Like for one thing, what's so special about human rights that's radically different, right? I mean, because we're animals. Like sure, we're kind of evolved differently to have higher levels of certain cognitive functions, but we are animals. We're primates. So, I mean, why is it that
yeah,
there's this radical distinction and everything? So,
yeah.
what do you think of
So
it?
yeah, I mean, so it's interesting to compare fetuses or babies to non-human animals, right? Because a lot of the things that people say about how humans differ from animals are also ways that adults differ from babies. So, babies are not very smart, right? And actually, adult animals might be smarter than human babies or fetuses, especially.
Yeah.
I assume fetuses are really dumb. um, and, like having free will, well, I don't think babies have free will, and certainly don't think fetuses have free will. And, like another thing people sometimes mention is being a member of society, right? Like, depending on your theory of the nature of morality, you might think that you have to be a member of society in order to be protected by moral constraints. But, like, oh, fetuses are not a member of society. Babies are not really members of society, right? I mean, just like, unless they're like honorary members or something,
Yeah.
right? Unless you can be a member without doing anything. But then, your pet animals probably also would then count. Okay, so I say all that to indicate the similarities. Um, and so I think there's a kind of inconsistency. There's like a frequent inconsistency that happens both on the left and on the right, right? So people on the left are more likely to be sympathetic to animal rights, but not fetus rights, right? But then people on the right will accept fetus rights and not animal rights, and it's a little strange. And it's not actually a logical contradiction because there are some differences, but it's a little weird. It should be that people who believe in rights for one of these should be more likely to believe in rights for the other, but it's the opposite, right? If you believe in fetus rights, you're less likely to accept animal rights. So that's weird, and vice versa, right? Um, okay, but so I think like the most coherent position would say a similar thing about both, right? So like if you have a really good reason, you can kill an animal, but don't just kill it for no reason, right? And you can cause harm to the animal, but not just for trivial reasons, right? And also probably if you have a fetus, If you have a really good reason, then you can kill it, but don't just kill it for no reason, right? Or for trivial reasons, right?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, talking about killing, there's a lot of interesting questions that come up because there are a lot of premises that come up in like the abortion debate that would seem really problematic for, and like, any premise that says something like it's only wrong to kill human persons and nothing else, like only innocent human persons can't be killed. That just seems like really problematic because there's a lot of things that are not human persons that it seems wrong to kill. So this is what we teased out a little bit before. It's kind of like the metaphysical differences people have, and sort of what implications that may have for rights. Like, I don't know whether you're like a hylomorphist or kind of what your view of the mind is, and whether animals have minds, or I guess non-human animals, I should say more accurately.
Yeah.
So yeah, metaphysically, there's kind of this distinction. I mean, Jeff McMahon talks about this a lot in his book, The Ethics of Killing. He goes through like the metaphysics, like the metaphysical views people have that have implications for how they think, killing animals is like a really serious thing, but people don't think about it all that much or consider it to be all that serious or as much as other things. But when we talk about like the metaphysics of the capacity of something to be harmed or the capacity of it to have its interests frustrated, it becomes very problematic for people who think wanton killing of animals is okay. So I don't know if do we need to draw any more about the metaphysical differences, or did we cover that already?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do want to comment on this. So, like, I think that people have a lot of overconfidence in sort of like abstract theoretical views, right? So you'll have people say things like, okay, so the humans have a rational soul and the animals don't have a rational soul, or something like that, and that's of crucial import. Like, are you really confident of that? Because that's a highly controversial view, right? So maybe humans have a soul, but that's controversial. So uh, a lot of people think that's wrong, so it might not be the case. So, it's to the point for me to ask, so if humans don't have souls, is it okay to torture us? Right? And like, so I think the answer is obviously no, right? So like your metaphysical view should not have a radical effect on your ethical views, probably, right? For most metaphysical issues. And this is similar to my question. If it turns out that we don't have free will, is it okay to torture us? So no. Now, these are interesting metaphysical issues, but you shouldn't like radically change your ethical view. And if you are doing that, what you're probably doing is rationalizing, right? So it's like people want people to have rights. We want us to have rights, and we want the other species that we benefit from, tormenting and using to not have rights. So let's try to make up like a metaphysical story about why that's the case, right? But then you see that there's a kind of insincerity because people wouldn't apply it, right? They say there's this metaphysical difference between humans and animals, and you say, okay, but if it turns out that you're wrong about the metaphysics, will you then say that it's okay to treat humans in the way that we treat animals? And like everybody says no, right? So that shows that that's not really why they're okay with torturing the animals.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And I think so. This is kind of like this relates to the question I asked earlier, about like this distinction between rights. I guess I wonder what you think here is like, should there be this distinction? Because John, as you talked about before, like there's ethicists that don't agree on whether or not even we have rights. There's controversial views about rights in the ethical sphere. But supposing that we do have rights, or that rights are a thing that's morally relevant, should there be a separation then between human and animal rights, or should it just be like there are rights that all creatures share? Because again, we're animals, so I don't see any need for this like partitioning off of like, well, here's us with our human rights, and here's the rest of like the rights that lesser things have that don't matter as much. So there's almost like this hierarchy of rights. And I don't see any reason personally to posit that. I think it's just like, well, if rights do exist, then they may apply in degrees, but they should apply, to everything. So do you agree there? What do you think? So again, assuming rights are, or maybe we're just using rights as like a linguistic, tool here, but just for the general idea of.
Yeah, Robert Nozick discusses this idea. I don't think he asserts it, but he discusses the idea that you might have a rights-based theory for interhuman ethics and a utilitarian view for non-human animals. That might be right. So, like, I don't see any reason why pain and suffering would only be bad if you're a member of our species, right? Or if you're a member of a
Hmm.
smart species. I don't see any relevance there, but there are reasons why it might be that only the intelligent species have rights. Okay, but by the way, this would also, like, it would be intelligent beings versus non-intelligent, not members of our species versus other species, right? So if there's another species that's intelligent, they would also have rights. Also, if there's a member of our species that's unintelligent, they would not have rights. Okay, so like if you hold this view, I don't think this is a dumb view to have, but if you hold this view, then you should think like, so maybe babies don't have rights. That doesn't mean it's okay to do anything you want, because like their pain and suffering is still bad, so don't torture the baby for no reason. But it means that consequentialist reasoning would apply to them. So like it would be okay to harm the baby, or like sufficiently mentally disabled people, be okay to harm them if doing so produces a greater good, right? Like because the point about rights is rights prevent you from sacrificing one even to produce a moderately greater benefit for others. Right? So like when you say that a person has a right to life, you're implying not only that killing them is bad, but also that it's not made up for even if you save more than one life. Right? Like you can't kill one innocent person to save two. Like that's implied in the right to life talk. All right. So the result of non-human animals not having rights would be you have to apply consequentialist reasoning. So you could kill the animal if you thereby save two animals. Right. But like you're not allowed to kill an innocent person even if that saves two innocent people. Right. Anyway, so I don't know. I don't know the answers to all this because like I don't know. I'm not certain if we have rights. I talk about rights a lot, so I guess we have rights, but I'm not certain of it, and I'm not sure why. So like I'm not I'm not sure if the animals have them as well. If animals have rights, I think they would not exactly have the same rights because some of our rights are tied to particular capacities. Right. So, sometimes people ask me if animals should have the right to vote. Okay. I think that people who say that do not, they're not asking that question seriously. But they're like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if somebody said the animals should have the right to vote? Anyway, so, well, I mean, if you're capable of voting, then yeah. Like, if you find an animal that is actually capable of voting, then yes, let it vote. But like if they're not capable of doing it, then you might think that means that they don't have the right, don't have the right to do it either, I guess.
Okay, so yeah, because some functional points there. Okay, yeah, I think that's a generally reasonable view to have because I think kind of this just too sharp of a distinction, saying animals have all the same rights equally as we do, is sort of because then people bring in the cases of they'll try to like counter animal rights arguments by saying, well, if you had to kill a pig or like your best friend, obviously you'd kill the pig, right? Like you, and it's so I mean it doesn't serve as a counterexample to being vegetarian or against factory farming to say that there are like degrees in which we respect different rights. But I think that's true. So this gets in a little bit more than the question of like, do we have any obligations to animals other than just limiting like mass suffering, or maybe mass suffering applies. So like, do we have the obligations to provide them with like healthcare at certain levels if they are injured or sick, or do we, kind of what are some of the moral issues surrounding like say putting them in zoos? Like, do we have the right to put them in zoos, like imprison them? Because maybe that's an interesting question. We can talk about that one first, the zoo example, because it's not like factory farming in the sense they're not being like tortured and killed, right? Because they're just sort of being just enclosed and fed and trained and everything. It's like they're not like facing like this terrible suffering every conscious moment and then killed for meat. But a lot of people do. A lot of animal rights people or animal people that are pro animal rights do have problems with the idea of zoos. It's because it seems like it's imprisoning animals without good reason. It's just again for like profit or like the general pleasure of people. But I wonder what you think there, because if we're going to say like consequentialist reasoning applies to animals, there's sort of the case to be made then that maybe like the whales at SeaWorld provide more money and then more pleasure for the audience that outweighs kind of the bad side of them being imprisoned for basically their whole
Yeah.
life. So what do you, I
Yeah.
mean, because your main problem, of course, was factory farming, because that's kind of the worst thing going on right now. But there are other issues that some people. So, what is your view on that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really worried about the zoos, but that so it depends upon how the animals are treated in the zoo, right? But I think I've been to some zoos where it looked like the animals had a pretty good life, and so like so there's like there's the benefit that humans get out of it, and the people running the zoo are making money, and then the zoo visitors are being entertained. But then there's like the benefit or cost to the animal, and well, I'm not sure that the animal is actually harmed overall at all, right? Like it might be better to live in a zoo because like it's safer, like, and nature is cruel, right? Like living out in nature isn't that great. Like living out in nature is way better than living on a factory farm, okay? But it might be less good than living in a zoo. I'm not really sure. Like it probably depends on the zoo, right? And depends on how much space they have and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, um, yeah. So like if the animals in the zoo have a pretty good life, then it's a win-win. It's better for them and better for us too.
Yeah, that's the ideal if we can get a win-win out of this. So, what about here's another one that's kind of prominent in the animal ethics literature is experimentation. It's like for research on animals, because people tend to think like, it's better to experiment on animals than humans, and that may be true, but kind of under what specifications should we, kind of what limits should we put maybe on animal research, if any?
Yeah. So because I'm not sure about the rights issue, like I would say, if experimenting on the animals would actually get us cures for major diseases, then we should go ahead and do it. On the other hand, if we're experimenting on animals so that we can develop more cosmetics, I don't think we should do that. Like, I don't think that's a good enough reason, right? Because we have plenty of cosmetics already, so it's like it could only be a trivial benefit. And then, but I mean, I think there are questions about how useful animal experimentation even is, right? Because most of the stuff that's going to work on animals is not going to work on humans. So then you have to test it on humans anyway, right? Most of the time, it turns out that it doesn't work. Also, it might be that because we have this protocol, we're missing stuff that would work on humans. Right? Because just like there's stuff that works on rats that doesn't work on humans, there's going to be stuff that works on humans that doesn't work on rats, and we're going to miss all of those because we have this method where you have to get through the rat testing first in order to get tested on humans. Right? So I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm not even sure if the animal experimentation is good for us. Not even sure if this is medically beneficial overall.
That's true. So there's some uncertainty about even the effects of the research, but kind of generally, again, yeah, if we could like cure cancer by experimenting on some rats, obviously we should do that, at least pretty obviously. So okay, what about do we owe animals any moral? I mean, again, well, if you're kind of uncertain about the rights issues, this may just be another sort of like uncertainty one. But do we owe animals anything, like in terms of if we have pets, say, do we owe them like health care if they get sick, like taking them to the vet? Or kind of our financial interest. I guess the point is like not talking about like factory farming and making money, but like on a smaller scale, can we prioritize maybe like our financial interests in like an immediate sense over like the well-being of animals that are in our immediate care or something like that? Or do we kind of owe animals any moral obligations, or is it kind of like just this general obligation of limiting suffering that matters?
Yeah. So for non-intelligent but sentient beings, I guess I think their only benefits and harms are hedonic. So they benefit from pleasure or enjoyment and are harmed by pain and suffering. So like other things that we worry about, we probably shouldn't worry about, right? We don't have to worry about their freedoms unless that has to do with their pleasure or suffering, right? Anyway, so do you have positive obligations to them? I don't know. So like if you have a pet, I don't know if you're morally obligated to take care of it or give it take it to the vet or whatever. But there's I would be very suspicious of a person who didn't want to, right? It's like you have a pet and you sort of like form this relationship with the animal, right? And if you form a regular relationship with someone and then you don't, when they're depending on you and you don't want to help them, it's like there's something wrong with you, right? Like if you don't want to take your cat to the vet when it gets sick, or you're just like, oh, this is going to cost a few $100, I'm just going to kill the cat. I do think there's something wrong with you if that's your reaction, right? Like I'm not sure if other people should do anything about that. I'm not sure if other people should interfere with that. But they should definitely have a disapproving attitude.
Yeah, definitely. I sure would hope so. Um, so yeah, one of the other things, I don't know if we have to, I mean, because there's kind of this relation we teased out a little bit to like environmental ethics, right? Like sort of factory farming is also just really bad for the environment. So if nothing else, like you should kind of consider not eating less meat just to help the environment, like stop climate change, global warming, the loss of biodiversity. But that's more of like environmental ethics, but still sort of relevant
Yeah.
here. Um, One thing, I had something else I was going to ask about pets, but I forgot. Oh yeah, the last thing was talking about factory farming. So kind of factory farming is sort of like, as we've covered, it's like it's causing like this mass amounts of suffering, and it's also causing like these mass amounts of harm to the environment, which is going to cause future suffering both for humans and non-human animals. So like, what measures are justified in stopping this, right? Because obviously, like we're kind of we're waiting on. I mean, the main thing that would help with this would be like government regulations of some kind or some sort of regulatory measures on this. But since we don't have that right now, there's sort of a lot of corporate interest involved in that. What measures can be like? What measures are we ethically within our rights to do to stop this? Like we talked about the stealing someone else's property, and as you said, like as long as you don't get caught, like it's fine to save these things from like a life of suffering. But say like you're in the act of saving like all these animals from a factory farm, and like the owner comes out and is going to kill you. Like, well, I guess that makes it a self-defense case. That's more
Yeah.
black and white. Darn it. Well, but I mean, like generally, like
Yeah.
how far are we able to go in terms of in stopping this? Like, could we potentially kill humans to save a certain amount of animals, or stop like a certain amount of factory farming, or kind of like what are the ethical
Yeah.
constraints on what we're able to do here?
Yeah. It's hard to say. So like you can use force to stop people from doing things that are horribly wrong, usually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can probably use force to stop human beings from grossly harming other animals without good reason, right? Um, whether you should in fact do that kind of depends upon how people are going to react to this and so on, right? So like, should you blow up the factory farm? Well, I don't know if you should actually do that. Like, it wouldn't be unjust, right? Like, it would be just. But also you're going to get in trouble, and I'm not sure if it would work, right? Like there might be a backlash, and sort of like people might hate vegans, and then that might actually harm the cause. I'm not sure, right? If it would actually help the cause, then it would totally be justified. You'd be justified in taking terrorist actions, right? Um, uh, you know, um, I mean, the main problem with terrorism. I mean, main problem with terrorism is that it usually kills a bunch of innocent people, but there could be terrorism that only kills people who are legitimate targets, right? But also the problem is there's actually research on this that it usually doesn't work, right? That is usually with most of these causes, the cause is not apparently advanced, right? So you should worry about that. You should worry about there being a potential backlash.
Okay. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So it's kind of just sort of like the earlier question. It's sort of similar. It's like whatever you can do that's not going to be detrimental to your personal well-being or the well-being of the movement, then it's like you're generally ethically justified. So I guess there's a difference between like the moral, what you're morally allowed to do, and what you probably should do, practically. So yeah, so we covered most of the big points. It was really fun. We're a little over an hour here, so I don't want to keep you for too long. But I guess the last question I had, kind of related to that one, then is we should obviously be careful about not taking terrorist actions, perhaps in these regards. But what should we do going forwards, given how big of a problem this is? I guess my thought has always been push for change in the same way people always have, with protesting and all that. Maybe do smaller animal liberation movements that are not going to be quite as damaging. But so I get the question is, then we have this huge problem of factory farming. It's a problem for the planet, it's a problem for ecosystems, and it's a problem just at a level of causing like mass amounts of suffering every year. And so it's obviously like a terrible atrocity. So what do we do? What's kind of the way to start going forwards here? I guess the first
Yeah.
steps.
And, the first thing is that you should personally stop contributing, right? You should,
Hmm.
stop buying the animal products. And then the second thing is you should tell other people about it, right? So like part of the reason why people don't give a shit is that there's not enough social pressure, right? Because like you can get people to be morally convinced that you can get people to be convinced that it's morally wrong to buy the animal products, and then they just keep doing it anyway because they don't have enough moral motivation. And what's basically the problem with humans is they don't care about morality unless somebody is publicly shaming them or something like that. Okay, so participate in the public shaming. And by the way, people get mad at vegans for making them feel bad and shaming them and whatever. Um, but that's just because people don't want to have to feel bad when they're doing immoral things, right? It's like, it's not because the vegans are doing something wrong. It's because the people who are doing something wrong don't want anyone else pointing it out and making them feel bad about it. Okay. Anyway, and then the other thing is, well, we should probably try to get more kind of humane treatment of animals laws, right? So, like, I wouldn't propose just completely banning meat. And the reason for that is just like, in my sort of like libertarian research, I've discovered that a lot of laws do not work out well. And so like, but just besides whether the law is morally justified, laws about things that a lot of people want to do frequently don't work. So you have the alcohol prohibition case, you have the case with the contemporary drug laws. They just don't work because there's so many people who want to do it, right? So what would happen if meat was completely outlawed is it would turn into this huge black market. There'd be this massive non-compliance. But there could be laws that require humane treatment of the animals, which would probably not generate a huge black market, right? Which, by the way, this is also a lesson that we should learn about the drug war as like a sort of like irrelevant digression. But the government would do a lot better at making recreational drugs safer if they merely regulated it. If it wasn't prohibited, but it was regulated, then you could make sure that the products were safe and that like people were getting what they were actually paying for and so on. But you can't do that if the whole thing is a black market because you prohibited the entire thing, right? So anyway,
Right.
similarly with meat, it is feasible that we could make it be produced humanely.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to cover there, but I don't want to keep you for too long. But I just wanted to say, everybody, check out Dr. Huemer's book. It's going to be great. And thank you so much for coming on. This was a really fun discussion, and I'm something I've been interested in recently. So thank you for being willing to come on and talk about it. It's going to be good.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Stop.